everyone. Sorry about my very late entry to the meeting there, but we're delighted to be extending our media and politics seminars to include some brilliant contributions from our early career colleagues over the next few months. So to start off that process, we've got Caroline Leicht from the University of Southampton, who's going to be talking to us about her PhD research on political satire and gender in particular. So I'm going to throw over to you, Caroline. I believe you're just doing a presentation and then we'll have a Q&A, right? Yeah. So perfect. So off you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. And thank you all for being here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation, really. Like Emily said, my name is Caroline. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Southampton, just started my third year. And in my PhD research, I look at political satire and the role of gender in this media format. So today's presentation is about my current paper on gendered representations and framing of candidates on the sketch comedy show Saturday Night Live in the United States. So as a quick overview, I will first just give you an introduction to the topic and talk about my theoretical framework and methodological approach. I will then present my results and discuss them as I go along. And finally, based on this discussion, I will talk about some future directions for the research agenda, as well as my own next steps. And then we can have our Q&A. So one question that I get regularly when I talk about my research is always along the lines of, why should we care about political satire? It's just entertainment. Well, technically, yes, but research would actually suggest otherwise. In the United States, more citizens get their election news from late night comedy shows than from national newspapers. And yet, the literature on media representations of candidates and presidential elections still largely focuses on national newspapers. But, the media landscape is ever changing and encompasses a wide array of different genres and formats. And while political satire is certainly situated on the more entertainment-oriented side of media, it does actually have substantive information about politics that are featured in these sketches or news parody shows like The Daily Show, and that makes it comparable to traditional news media in that sense. So while the research on political satire has been slowly expanding, there are still significant gaps in the literature. First, the research is primarily focused on audience effect and news parody programs, such as The Daily Show, like I mentioned before. And second, while there have been some comparative studies between political satire and news media coverage, the focus is then usually on partisanship as a mediating factor in presentations of candidates. So my research project makes a novel contribution to the literature by examining an understudied genre of political satire, namely sketch comedy, and exploring the role of gender in representations of candidates. But why gender? Well, understanding gender representations of candidates in the media is important because it provides insights into how voters perceive political processes and actors. Obviously, the media act as disseminators of news and as such hold the power to set the agenda, making some political issues or characteristics of political actors more salient for their respective audience than others. So biases observed in political systems and voting behaviors can thus usually be traced back to media coverage, because that is where citizens receive their election news and information. So one such bias is obviously how political candidates are perceived based on gendered stereotypes and representation. So again, the research has so far been focused on newspapers and other more traditional news media formats. So we already know quite a bit about how gender plays a role in representations of candidates there, but we don't know how it plays into political satire coverage. So in this paper, I asked two questions. First, how are male and female candidates presented in political satire? And for this, I looked at gender role congruity, which I will talk more about in just a second. And second, does gender mediate the prevalence of frames in political satire? So role congruity theory and social role theory are two of the key theoretical concepts to understand how gender mediates representations and perceptions of political candidates. And they are also key concepts that I build on in my research. So they describe how gender traits and stereotypes are ascribed to men and women respectively, based on the roles they traditionally occupied in society. And research has shown that political leadership roles are still regarded in more masculine terms. So female political leaders or women aspiring to become political leaders are thus seen as incongruent with that political leadership role. However, the more they act in accordance with the role, the more they are then seen as incongruent with their ascribed gender role. And this creates a gender double bind because a perceived inconsistency with social or gender roles can lower evaluations of political leaders or candidates. So links between gender and the tone or framing of media coverage have obviously long been established in political science and communications research, and I'm obviously preaching to the choir here today, but my goal is to see whether these links also exist in the media format of political satire. So based on what we know from the existing literature and theoretical frameworks, I expected the following to be the case in this analysis. First, that male candidates would be presented as more gender role congruent than female candidates. And then second, there were two expectations with regard to framing that are kind of related to one another. So I called them A and B. First, issue framing is expected to be more frequently used for male candidates than for female candidates. And then second, candidate framing would be more frequently used for female candidates than for male candidates. So my cases for this study were the 2016 and 2020 US presidential elections, and my sample consisted of Saturday Night Live sketches about the Democratic primaries and the general election. So all in all, those were 40 sketches, which came down to around 5 hours of video material in total. So I spent a lot of time on YouTube. And to capture the full essence of the sketches, I took a mixed methods approach. So first, to examine the visuals, I developed a coding scheme based in parts on existing works and in other parts on initial viewing of the sketches. A randomized subsample of 25% was secondary coded by 2 researchers, and the Cohen's-Kaplan scores all reflected perfect or at least substantial agreement. And shout out to those 2 people who helped me there. I think one of them might actually be on the call today. And then second, to capture some of the textual elements of the sketches, I used framing analysis building on Young and Oh's work on election news frame. So for the content analysis section, gender role congruity scores were determined as can be seen here. I first calculated feminine scores and masculine scores, and as indicated here, some of these variables were drawn from Carpinella and Bauer's work on visuals in campaign communications, and others were added based on initial viewing of the sketches and general insights from the literature. For each sketch, the candidates were assigned 3 characteristics from a list of traits, drawing on Leigh and DeMeyer's work on negative and positive gender traits, and Conroy et al.'s Dictionary of Gender Traits. And results on feminine and masculine traits were then also used to determine the overall gender role congruity scores, and the final element of those scores were defeminization and demasculization coding as well. Now, the exciting part, the results of the analysis. So I will start with the content analysis results for gender role congruity, and here we have the 2016 results. And as we can see, the male candidates were portrayed as more gender role congruent than Hillary Clinton in both election cycles. The difference in gender role congruity scores was significant in the Democratic primaries, but not significant in the general election. So in the general election, there were some outliers in the data that could explain this, and I will talk more about those as we go on, but just something to already keep in mind. Overall, though, the male candidates were consistently portrayed as more gender role congruent than Hillary Clinton, which confirms the gender double bind and role congruity theory and gives support to my hypothesis. So then looking at the results of the 2020 election, these observations are somewhat echoed. In the Democratic primaries on the left here, or at least on the left on my screen, Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris were both portrayed as the left gender role congruent than their male opponents. And the difference between gender role congruity scores for Warren and Biden and Warren and Sanders, as well as Harris and Biden and Harris and Sanders, was significant. Interestingly, though, Pete Buttigieg was portrayed as gender role incongruent on average, like the female candidates. So the difference in gender role congruity scores between Warren and Buttigieg and Harris and Buttigieg was also not significant. Possible explanation for this could be that Buttigieg is an openly gay man. Research has found that sexuality, like race, can have mediating effects on gendered representations of candidates. So I will provide some more insights on this specific case in just a minute, but just to keep it in mind already. But before we do that, let's look at the general election here on the other side. Kamala Harris is portrayed a lot more gender role congruent than during the primaries, and she's portrayed as more gender role congruent than Biden. However, Biden was obviously not her direct opponent, so this may not be the most comparable case. So let's compare her results instead with those of Pence, who was her direct opponent. And we can clearly see here that Pence was portrayed as significantly more gender role congruent than Harris, and Pence only appeared in one sketch, but in that sketch, this difference between those two actually does hold up. So that is the case there as well. So let's take a bit of a closer look at the results on gender role congruity. First up, we have the 2016 primaries. As you can see, there was variation in the general congruity scores across the sketches, but this variation was not random. So for Clinton on the left here, she was less general congruent, the more congruent she was perceived to be with the political leadership role. So I have circled some notable declines here. Those are the sketch about her campaign announcement, a campaign advertisement, both debate sketches, a sketch about her electoral wins, and a final sketch in which it has become clear that she will be the likely nominee. So you can clearly sense a bit of a pattern there. For Sanders here on the other side, it is quite the opposite, actually. In the debate sketches, in a sketch about an election day, the Iowa caucuses, he is portrayed as more general congruent, which is circled in green here. And the red circles indicate sketches about his electoral losses and Sanders not winning the nomination at the end of the primaries. So as you can see, he records significantly lower general congruity scores there. So overall, he's portrayed as less general congruent, the less congruent he's perceived to be with the political leadership role. So do these observations hold up in other election cycles, or is this just limited to Clinton and Sanders? Let's look at 2020. So here we have Elizabeth Warren on the left, Joe Biden on the right. Once again, there is a link between general congruity scores and congruity with the political leadership role. So Warren is portrayed as less general congruent in debate sketches and in segments in which she discusses policies or has shown fundraising for her campaign. So these are, once again, the ones circled in red. The sketch circled in green at the very end there is one that was broadcast immediately after she had dropped out of the race. And the one before that was where she was discussing that she would probably drop out of the race because she was running out of funds. So as you can see, she was portrayed as more general congruent there. Biden was portrayed as general congruent across the campaign, except for one sketch, which is circled in red here. This is the Equality Town Hall sketch, which saw some of the candidates, including Biden, discussing LGBTQ+ rights. And Warren was also in the sketch, and for her, it's one of the sketches here in the middle, number 6 there. And that was obviously where she was portrayed as more general congruent. But for Biden, the opposite is the case. He's portrayed as less general congruent as he discusses LGBTQ+ rights. For Biden, the sketches circled in green are the debate sketches. And as you can see, he records his highest general congruity scores there. So the observations that we made for Sanders in 2016 do hold up for Biden here as well. Now, Bernie Sanders and Pete Buttigieg in 2020, very different from each other. Very, very different graphs here. Like Biden, Sanders is portrayed as general congruent across the campaign, and he did not appear in the Equality Town Hall sketch. So the debates are once again the sketches where he records the highest general congruity scores, while the sketch in which he discusses dropping out of race, the last one here, circled in red, sees a decline in his general congruity score, once again, as was also the case in the 2016 primaries for him. On the right, we have Pete Buttigieg, the case that I mentioned before. His general congruity scores were more comparable to those of the female candidates and those of the male candidates, which I mentioned when we looked at the overall scores. His general congruity score declined in debate or town hall sketches, including the Equality Town Hall sketch. And the score was very high in his first sketch, where he appeared as a guest on the morning chat show The View, along with his husband, Chasten. So more of this family soft news kind of portrayal. And the general congruity score increased after he recorded an electoral win in the Iowa caucuses and was suddenly perceived to be a frontrunner in the race. So it's quite a mixed bag for him. With regard to the debates, he's more like the female candidates. But with regard to electoral wins, he's more like the male candidates. So those were the party-specific election cycles, but what do the general elections tell us? So in 2016, Clinton recorded a lower general congruity score in the debate sketches, as was the case in the primaries as well. However, she recorded a higher general congruity score in the town hall debate sketch, which was the second of the presidential debate sketches, in which she primarily discussed healthcare issues. And in the final sketch, where she was repeatedly asked whether she could possibly be elected, she also recorded a bit of a higher general congruity score. So Trump's general congruity score is mostly linked to the Access Hollywood tape, which is the outlier that I mentioned earlier. So the second sketch was about the leak specifically, and the final sketch addressed it once again. And as you can see, those are two sketches in which he recorded sort of an increase in his general congruity score. So this is sort of like an outside factor that might have played into it, but we will talk about that a little bit more later. So turning to 2020, Trump recorded his highest gender role congruity scores in the debates, particularly after his COVID infection for some reason. I don't know why, but that is the observation here. And he also recorded a high gender role congruity score in a sketch about a town hall he did with Savannah Guthrie, in which the SNL version of it was that Trump physically, instead of verbally, sparred with the moderator. So they actually attacked one another physically. Biden also recorded higher gender role congruity scores in the debate sketches like Trump, but he did not physically fight any moderators, and his gender role congruity score declined in the town hall sketch, as well as in the final sketch where he is seen doubting his electoral prospects. And then, of course, we also have Kamala Harris here. Interestingly, she records a higher gender role congruity score when she does not explicitly talk about or appear as being the vice presidential candidate, which is the third sketch here. She's portrayed as significantly less gender role congruent than Pence in the VP debate sketch, which is circled in orange here. That's the second sketch, which I previously mentioned as well. So that does hold up, and you can clearly see the difference here. So what are the key takeaways of the content analysis section? So first, the hypothesis was supported. Male candidates were found to be portrayed as more gender role congruent than female candidates. This also confirms the theoretical framework and prior findings on the gender double bind and role congruity theory. The second, sexuality was found to be a possible mediating factor for gender role congruity in candidate representations here. The case of Buttigieg clearly suggested this, and observations such as Biden being portrayed as gender role incongruent in a sketch about LGBTQ plus rights, and Warren being portrayed as more gender role congruent in the same sketch, further underline this initial observation. Obviously, race and sexuality have previously been found to have mediating effects on the role of gender in candidate representations. So it does appear that this could be the case in political satire as well, though of course, more research will be needed to actually confirm whether this was specific to the 2020 election, the 2020 candidates, or SNL as this specific political satire case. And then third, there was a link between gender role congruity and congruity with the political leadership role, which I pointed out throughout the section. Female candidates were found to be portrayed as less gender role congruent, the more congruent they were perceived to be with the political leadership role, while male candidates were portrayed as less gender role congruent, the less congruent they were perceived to be with the political leadership role. So this further confirms the gender double bind and suggests that it may be applicable to male candidates sort of in reverse as well. The observations from the content analysis also suggest support for prior findings from the literature that debates are framed in stereotypically masculine ways, because that is obviously what I pointed out about the debate sketches here as well. So let's move on to the framing analysis section. Both Sanders and Trump, respectively, received more issue coverage than Clinton in the 2016 primaries and general election, which does confirm the first hypothesis on framing. Results from the Democratic primaries suggest support for the second hypothesis on framing, because Clinton received more candidate framing than Sanders, which we can see here. However, in the general election, Clinton received less candidate framing than Trump, which contradicts the hypothesis. But this could be a possible Trump effect, because SNL may have been keen to explore the character of such a polarizing political figure like Trump a little bit further, especially because he was somewhat new on the political scene, as opposed to Clinton, who people were already very familiar with. So the 2020 election cycle provides some further insights once again. As you can see here in the Democratic primaries on the left, Biden, Buttigieg, and Sanders all received more issue coverage than Kamala Harris, which once again supports the first hypothesis on framing. This was also the case in the general election, where Biden, Trump, and Pence all received more issue framing than Harris as well. Elizabeth Warren is a bit of an outlier here, though, as you can see. She received more issue framing than the male candidates in the Democratic primaries. And this is a case that we will look at a little bit further in just a minute, and I will explain one idea that I had of why this might be the case. But before we do that, let's look at the second hypothesis on framing. Support is found in the Democratic primaries because Warren received more candidate framing than the male candidates. And in the general election, Trump and Biden received more candidate framing than Harris, which does contradict the hypothesis. However, once again, obviously her case is more comparable to Pence because they were vying for the same level in government. So as a vice presidential candidate, Harris's results should be compared to Mike Pence, and that once again they were only in one sketch together, and Mike Pence only appeared in this one sketch. And that is the VP debate sketch, and both Harris and Pence, and this suggests support for the hypothesis, actually, as we can see. So let's look at two cases a little bit further, Elizabeth Warren and the VP debate. So first, Elizabeth Warren on the left here. This is the full results for the framing analysis for all of Warren's sketches in the Democratic primaries. So notably, she received no issue framing at all in 5 of the 11 sketches, and in 2 of the 11 sketches, she received less issue framing than candidate framing. So you've probably already noticed it. There are some sketches here in which she records very, very high issue framing shares, particularly in the 6th one right here in the middle. And those are sketches in which she discusses her policies or fundraisers for her campaign. So a possible explanation for this observation is that Warren's focus on policies and fundraising was used as the most frequent punchline for jokes about Warren on SNL. So the SNL Warren character was very much a candidate who was almost annoyingly well prepared, almost annoyingly educated, and definitely sort of a nerd who will not shut up, even though some people might want her to. And had all of these plans and ideas, which is obviously something that was reported about Warren as well. She was this candidate who had a plan for everything, and she also used that in her own campaign communications. And then that really influenced the SNL character that was developed for her. So it's not necessarily a positive thing that she received so much issue coverage, because it is a punchline of jokes. So it is somewhat negative as well. So in examining political satire, we do need to be aware of these nuances that are not necessarily something that we need to be aware of in more traditional news media coverage. But yeah, here the way the comedic character was structured may have impacted the framing, and this could explain why the results for Warren are a bit of an outlier compared to the other candidates. So on the right side here, we have the VP debate framing analysis. And as I said, this is the only sketch that featured both Harris and Pence. So while Harris makes some cameos in some of the Biden-Trump sketches as a mother character who offers them some snacks if they behave during the debate, she's obviously less comparable to those two candidates because she is the vice presidential and not the presidential candidate. So the more comparable case, like I said before, Harris and Pence, because they're the direct opposition. And as you can see here, the VP debate sketch does confirm the two hypotheses on framing. Pence receives more issue framing than Harris, and Harris receives more candidate framing than Pence. So what are the key takeaways of the framing analysis? First, support for the first hypothesis on framing was found, and male candidates received more issue coverage than female candidates. And as discussed, Warren's issue coverage in the 2020 primaries was a bit of an outlier, but like I said before, it could be explained through her characterization and the fact that her policies are just the main punchline of jokes about her. And second, results on the second hypothesis were a bit inconclusive, unfortunately. Clinton received more candidate framing than Sanders in the 2016 primaries. Warren received more candidate framing than her male opponents in the 2020 primaries. And Harris received more candidate framing than Pence in the 2020 general election. So this all confirms the hypothesis, great, but Clinton received less candidate framing than Trump in the 2016 general election, and Harris received less candidate framing than her male opponents in the 2020 primaries, which contradicts the hypothesis. So all female candidates did receive more candidate and issue framing across the sketches in the sample. And this would be very, very interesting. However, this was also the case for the male candidates. So not that much of an observation there, but it does somewhat echo findings from political satire research, which has previously suggested that there may be more candidate framing than issue framing in general. But this was usually just found for news parody shows. So finding this for sketch comedy is still an interesting finding and one that I hope to explore further as well. So overall, 3 key takeaways. Male candidates are presented as more gender role congruent than female candidates in political satire, which confirms the first hypothesis. Male candidates received more issue coverage than female candidates in satire, and female candidates received more candidate and issue coverage, but not necessarily more candidate framing than male candidates. So arguably, the elections and candidates in the sample were somewhat polarizing, to say the least. So this could be a possible limitation of the study, of course. And as discussed in the content analysis section, there were also some possible mediating factors that I identified, such as sexuality or outside factors like the Access Hollywood tape leak. So more research will also be needed to sort of explore these mediators a little bit further. Additionally, joke punchlines and the development of the comedic character of candidates will need to be explored further as well to sort of better understand possible outliers in the data, such as Warren's issue framing in 2020. You will also remember that Kamala Harris receives less candidate framing than the male candidates in the primaries. I have not found a conclusive explanation for this, but it could be the case that the presence of more than one woman in the sample could lead to contrasting portrayals, which could then affect the results a little bit. So I do aim to explore it further as well. Finally, obviously, there are possible biases or other effects that need to be taken into account. For example, SNL is often considered to be more liberal leaning. So it could be that they are biased toward Democratic candidates in general elections. And also some of the observations, such as the 2016 general election observations, could also be due to a possible Trump effect, because arguably, like I said, he was a very polarizing candidate, obviously very unique political candidate, not something that we'd necessarily seen before. So that could have affected these results as well. Then there's also something that I have just called sort of the McKinnon effect for now. Both Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Elizabeth Warren in 2020 were portrayed by SNL cast member Kate McKinnon. So those two candidates also received the most coverage by SNL during the respective election cycles. And with the exception of some of the Buttigieg sketches, all other candidates were portrayed by guest actors as opposed to cast members. So it might have been more difficult to book these guest actors for an episode, or it may have been more difficult for the writing staff to write material for them, as they would have naturally been more familiar with McKinnon's style of comedy. Additionally, SNL cast members are closely involved in the writing process, and they do have a seat at the table. So McKinnon, who has publicly said that she supported Clinton and Warren, could have influenced the portrayal as well. So on that note, I would really like to explore these possible links and background effects and biases further. And I have received ethics approval for a lead interview with the comedians involved in the SNL productions. And I'm actively trying to recruit participants at the moment, so fingers crossed. But that would be very interesting to just find out sort of what goes into that process and how that may actually shape what we as the viewers see on screen, and then how that might affect audience responses and their information about politics. And in addition to this, I'm currently working on a comparative analysis of SNL material and material from TikTok comedians. So social media comedy has obviously become increasingly more popular, just like any other social media that we observe. And it was very big during the 2020 election in particular. And an added benefit of using TikTok data is just that this type of comedy is usually also performed in sketch formats, so it makes it comparable to the SNL case. And I will present results of this study at the PSA conference in April, so do come along then. Of course, there's also potential to compare observations about SNL to other political satire shows and formats on television to control for a possible SNL bias. Obviously, news parody shows would be the obvious choice as always, but I would argue that there are also certainly other interesting cases to take into account. I'm also working on a comparative analysis of gender representations of candidates in political satire and traditional news media, to explore whether political satire is comparable to traditional news media coverage of these election cycles as well, and whether there's meta coverage in both directions, perhaps. So this will be the second chapter of my PhD dissertation, and I will also present this at the PSA conference in April, so I will be very busy then. Another aspect that I aim to explore further is the observed links between gender role congruity and political leadership role congruity. I've already conducted some initial comparisons between gender role congruity and polling data to sort of explore whether that might be a link. And my hope is that this will provide some insights into how gendered representations in media may be impacted by the state of the race as well. So that could maybe tie into the whole Access Hollywood tape link, for example, and maybe help me explain that phenomenon. So finally, looking a little further ahead, the third chapter of my PhD dissertation, I will then turn to the third actor in political satire, which is the audience. So I've received ethics approval to examine Twitter data from the 2016 and 2020 election cycles to measure public discourse and audience response around the SNL broadcast. So let's all hope that Twitter does not go down in the meantime. And also, depending on how the primaries shape up going into 2024, it might be possible to run an experiment at some point this year. Hopefully, I'm trying to submit the thesis before the primary contest start next year, but we'll see about that. Also, obviously, if Biden and Trump run, then that will not really be a good case to examine because people are just too familiar with them already to measure whether SNL or something would affect that. But that is always something that could be a potential postdoc as well. And yeah, that really concludes my presentation on this paper so far. Just thank you so far. Thank you for listening. And obviously very happy to hear any questions or comments.
Oh, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Caroline. There was so much in there. I was kind of furiously scribbling notes about questions. But what I'll do is see if our audience have any questions first. And if not, I'll insert myself because I've got loads I could say. Any questions? Anybody like to go first? Oh, Amy Tatum's got her hand up. If you'd like to come in.
Hello, hi Caroline. It was brilliant. It was really, really interesting. I could have listened to you keep talking. So yeah, it was great. And I think it's really interesting the findings that you've got. You talked a little bit about McKinnon. Are you going to look at who portrayed them, who wrote the sketch, all of that sort of thing? And also I wondered if you'd looked at race in terms of Kamala Harris. And I think that's really going to be an important factor to how Rudolph sort of portrayed her and some of the stuff that was going on there as well, which is why she's probably coming across or being portrayed slightly differently to Clinton and Warren. And this is a little bit off topic, but I just wondered if you had watched the Theresa May sketch and what your thoughts were, because I thought it was like one of the most damning things I've ever seen for a woman political leader. But I just wondered what your thoughts were, given that this is your area. So thank you so much.
Yeah. Which Theresa May sketch do you mean?
When they Sarah Bareilles, she used to be mine sketch.
Yeah, I know what you mean. Yeah. So I'm just going to start with the first question, which was sort of, am I going to look at who portrayed these people and who wrote the sketches? Yes, I am, because I feel like that is important to just know, because obviously that can influence the voice of it. There is some information about who wrote these sketches. Obviously, I know who portrayed them, but I'm still hoping that these interviews will come through so that I can get a bit of a more in-depth view of that. To answer it, obviously, we can all see who portrayed them, but in terms of who wrote it in the 2016 election cycle, the head writers were Chris Kelly and Sarah Schneider, so a woman and a gay man. And they wrote most, if not all, of the sketches, particularly the ones for Clinton, because they were also very good friends with Kate McKinnon, which once again speaks to this sort of dynamic behind the scenes. And then during the 2020 election cycle, the head writers were Colin Jost and Michael Che, who are the co-anchors of Weekend Update, for those of you who watch SNL. So a Black man and just regular man, I guess. And so those are the dynamics a little bit. So it did change in the meantime, and it might have affected some of it. So I'm going to look at that a little bit more, but that will be sort of part of my thesis and not necessarily this paper. What you mentioned about race and Maya Rudolph portraying Kamala Harris, for example, I do think that I should look at it. I haven't so far, but I think that that would be a very valuable added thing to this whole project, because obviously it's not just sexuality for Pete Buttigieg that is a mediating factor, but it could also be race. So that is something that I want to look at. I haven't so far, so I can't speak about it, but very good point, and thank you for bringing that up. Then finally, the Theresa May sketch. For those of you who have not seen it, I would highly recommend it. It is Kate McKinnon playing Theresa May sort of during the Brexit negotiations, sort of her trying to get the Brexit deal through Parliament, and she's very upset that people don't like her, and then has a little affair with Winston Churchill, and then finds out that she can actually solve Brexit. So it's very interesting, and definitely from a gender perspective, it is extremely interesting that this woman leader has to have an affair with a man who was prime minister before her to actually get legislation passed in Parliament. So that is sort of this very interesting dynamic there, and there's so much to unpack there, and it's definitely something that I would like to explore further as well. But I mean, obviously, my supervisors, when they see this, they will hate me for this, but I'm already doing too much, so I can't do more. I can only do so much in a PhD thesis, but this portrayal of sort of foreign affairs, in a sense, like obviously this was from a US perspective, is very interesting to me, and I would love to sort of compare different perspectives internationally in political satire on affairs in different countries. For example, I mean, Brexit is a prime example. Obviously, everybody covered that. But yeah, there's definitely so much to still explore because it is very understudied. So I would love to do that in the future. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, brilliant. I see Ellen's got her hand up as well. If you want to come in.
Hey, can you hear me? Lovely. First of all, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. It was kind of fun as well, I think, to take a bit of a trip down memory lane with some of these pictures and some of these sketches. I've got one quite narrow question and then one less questiony, harder to answer question. So let's start with the easier one. I was just curious how kind of easy or difficult it was for you to do this coding for sort of gender congruence or incongruence, and if there were things that were kind of difficult about that, then I'd just be curious to know what they were, like which aspects of trying to code for like gender roles and gender stereotypes were maybe a bit more challenging, or had you questioning yourself a bit more in the process. And then secondly, I know this is something you said that you might do or someone else might do in future, but I was just wondering in general what your impression is of what the whole sketch format adds to satire in terms of making it, or does it help to make it a slightly less male space? Because most of the satire programs that I watch are like some of the others that you described, where they're hosted by like one male sort of news anchor type, or they have that guy and then also like a panel of comedians who are usually also men as well. So I know that you said obviously that this is definitely not a case of necessarily more equals better in terms of the representation, because the representation can literally be mocking or grounded in stereotype, but on the whole, I'd be interested in how you think this sketch format is different from others, or whether you think it brings anything different. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great question. Thanks. On the first one, on coding, I mean, it sort of made sense in my head on the first go, and then I had secondary coders come in, and that made some of the stuff more interesting, because we had these conversations obviously about sort of some of these cases that were very specific. So there, one that I definitely remember is the final Democratic primary sketch in 2016 is sort of Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders at a bar, which is fine at first, and then they start dancing the waltz, and Clinton leads, and Sanders plays the role of the woman in the dance. So that was sort of this debate of, I mean, obviously Sanders was still sort of dressed masculine. He was still saying, oh no, I'm going to lead, but then he didn't. And it was sort of this, is that demasculization? Is it not? It was sort of these aspects that are a little bit on the verge of things. And obviously for Hillary Clinton, you have this case, she always wore pantsuits. It's like, that is very masculine. But then sometimes you would have a massive pearl necklace. And then it's sort of this decision of, does that push it over the edge for feminine or for masculine? So it was sort of making these little adjustments and finding like justifications for them, and sort of making the coding scheme more detailed as I went along as well. So sort of as I went along, and then also when the secondary coders came in, those were conversations that we had. So that's, I guess, but it was very fun to sort of get to develop it a little bit myself as well. And an interesting process that I can definitely, if there's ever trivia about SNL sketches, I can definitely do that now. Very good at pub quizzes. That's a niche area. Can definitely quote some of the sketches because I've just seen them too many times. But yeah, what does the sketch format add to satire? I mean, what first drew me to studying this was that it's obviously like these people look made to look exactly like the candidates. So if you watch that and then watch the regular debate, you're sometimes wondering sort of who said that? Like, especially if you're not completely into politics, like not a complete politics nerd, just a regular viewer in a sense, which I can't say about myself, but you know, other people might. So that's one aspect that really stuck out to me. And in 2008 with Sarah Palin, for example, so many people think that she, like Sarah Palin, the real Sarah Palin, said, "I can see Russia from my house," but she didn't. That was just Tina Fey on SNL. So it's these kinds of things that sort of drew me to it in the first place, because it's so interesting. And that's not necessarily something that you see happen when you have a news parody show or like a late night talk show, like you mentioned, where you just have one person sitting in front of the camera telling jokes, because that you can definitely differentiate a little bit more. In terms of gender, that is a very good point. So obviously, pretty much all of the late night hosts in the US are men. And there are now some more women that come into it, but then those are on streaming services exclusively, and then not many people will see that. So it's definitely something that adds to it, because you have representation of all of the candidates that are in the race. And that is women and men and different people who look differently. So it's more diversity in that sense. And you can obviously have somebody like Kate McKinnon come in, who is an openly a gay person as well, and she portrays Hillary Clinton, and then Hillary Clinton comes in, the real one, to stand before her and says, "Oh yeah, I did so much for gay rights," and Kate McKinnon says, you could have supported that sooner, but as Hillary Clinton. So it's sort of this very meta thing that's going on, which is also very interesting to see. I do think there is some movement sort of in late night comedy as well in terms of gender diversity. Seth Meyers, for example, on late night has a segment called Jokes Seth Can't Tell, where two of his writers come in. One is Black and one is a lesbian, and then they tell jokes that they think Seth Meyers, as a straight cis white man, cannot tell, because it's not his joke to tell in a sense. So these are like these little things that are coming in and that are very popular as well. So I think it might actually come from that a little bit. Seth Meyers obviously had his start on SNL, which is sketch comedy, and it might just sort of, we might see a bit of a turn in late night comedy, but I'm excited to see it, and I'm excited to see sort of how that all develops. Hope that somewhat answers the question.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Brilliant. Any other questions? if not, I'll insert myself at this point. I suppose I'm picking up a little bit on what Ellen was asking you about the coding in a way, in terms of when you're coding for issues and candidate kind of focus. I'm wondering how the sort of competing demands for satirizing accurately enough that people can recognize it, and then the demands of the comedy audience. So like, are certain issues and certain candidate traits much more what's the word? Is this a word, satirizable, than others? Like, are they more easy to satirize like than others? And sort of how do you think that plays into gendered effects? Because I was just interested in the extent to which they might play with gender stereotypes as part of the satire as well, and how that complicates the sort of analysis that you're trying to do here. So hopefully that made sense as a question.
Yeah, thank you. No, it does. Yeah, it's definitely there's also these nuances that I have to be aware of a little bit. So it's a little bit more difficult than if I were to just look at traditional news media coverage. But that's also why I'm trying to compare that in the next step, because I feel like a lot of what makes it onto SNL is because it was covered in the news media, or it was a particularly viral moment on Twitter after the debates, for example. So obviously they have to take their inspiration from somewhere as well. And I think it might be that. So that's why I'm exploring it. But yeah, there's definitely some stuff that you can obviously make more fun of than others. But I was very surprised by the amount of substantive information that I actually did find. I mean, it wasn't just, especially the Trump-Clinton debates, you could have just had Trump following Clinton around the stage, and that would have been funny as a standalone thing. And they did do that, but they also had Kate McKinnon as Hillary Clinton, like listing her entire healthcare plan, like step by step, while Trump was approaching her to the Jaws theme song. So it's like they can make stuff funny while still having this substantive information in there. So it's very interesting sort of how they play with these different layers. So they were making fun of Trump while having Clinton provide like substantial issue coverage in a sense. So that's very interesting. And yeah, I mean, for Hillary Clinton, she was often portrayed as this sort of almost masculine person, like very, very staunch, I guess. But that's also how she's portrayed in traditional news media, mostly, and in public discourse. So they just sort of used that public image of her, but then still made her like this. They played a lot with that granny image a little bit, which she obviously used in her own campaign communication. So I think it's sort of this mixture of making fun of how the candidate themselves portray themselves and how media and the public portray them. And then that sort of creates this comedic character from what I've observed. But yeah, it's very interesting, and it's also obviously kind of hard to see what just was funny and what actually was a specific choice to include that. So that's why I do hope that I can have those interviews, because that will just help so much. But from what I've seen so far, it is definitely, there is sort of this element of press meta coverage as well, where SNL sort of focuses on one specific issue or like one specific characteristic, and it's sort of like this wink at the press doing, like, focusing too much on one thing, and it's SNL sort of saying, oh, you're being ridiculous and focusing too much on this one thing. That's also something that happens. So yeah, there's different elements, different layers, and I could probably talk about this for at least an hour, but I'm not going to. So
yeah, no, I just wonder, it's just an interesting kind of thing about the qualitative detail that's must be in all those videos that you've kind of absorbed, and then trying to kind of quantify those things must have been quite a challenge. So
yeah, and I'm going to have some like qualitative quotes in my thesis as well to sort of underline what I found quantitatively. But that's obviously not something that I can include in this paper as well, because it's already
You can't do
But yeah,
everything, absolutely.
But it is very interesting, obviously, to sort of just explore these quotes as well and just see the different layers of them. Yeah.
Brilliant. Anyone like to come in with probably got time for another question? Oh, sorry, my computer just went funny, but I just see James has put his hand up.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you, Caroline, for a really interesting presentation. And I suppose my question is kind of like building on, I think towards in the final slide where you kind of think about the implications of the research and that kind of finding that you had that across all of the candidates, there was more candidate-focused coverage than issue-focused. And it made me think of, in terms of comparing this to kind of like research on kind of like political news or election coverage, kind of a common kind of theme through that is the critique the too much news content focuses on personalities and the horse race over policy. And it made me think about, well, how does that kind of fit with the expectation of satire and comedy? Like, to what extent does this kind of finding connect with that debate, and what expectations should we have when we go into kind of like, this kind of like infotainment stuff, news kind of stuff in terms of what we should get out from it? I remember reading years ago a journal article on the West Wing that was super kind of like critical of the audience for even thinking that they could use that as a potential like source of information about politics. And yeah, it's kind of, for me, I thought it was slightly cruel in the way that they kind of talked about the audience in that respect. But also, I suppose that kind of people, this is why the elite interviews would be so fascinating going into this, aren't necessarily thinking about their political or civic responsibility to educate audiences. It's a I don't know, just I suppose a question, if I can get to it, is kind of how this fits alongside that election coverage debate in the news, and should there be an expectations for satire to inform and educate audiences on these issues?
Yeah, no, thank you. That's a great question, and it's definitely why I want to compare the two as well. Because, like I said, there have been some studies sort of on substantive information found in political satire, or in that sense, news parody in those cases. And it's always compared to sort of this horse race coverage focus in the traditional news media as well. That's why I want to compare it. And I can definitely say going into the initial framing analysis for this paper, it was also very interesting, because it's just, I wasn't expecting there to be that much issue coverage going into it. Because, I mean, I'd seen the sketches, but I hadn't really focused on it from that perspective. So it was very interesting to see how much like actual political information was in there. Like I said, they listed pretty much the entire proposal that Hillary Clinton had for healthcare. And that's, you don't have to do that in comedy, but they did. And it's sort of, it's interesting. I would be very curious to hear the motivations behind that. But obviously I can only see it from the outside now. And I think it does compare sort of in a sense where it's, when we observe horse race coverage in traditional news media, and that sort of is the focus instead of the issues, then that would be comparable to political satire in a sense that obviously entertainment is the focus, but then there's still issue coverage. And it's interesting because political satirists don't have to adhere to journalistic standards or ethics. They can just run wild. They don't have to be aware of any potential biases. And that's interesting because, like I said, there was definitely a bit of a bias in the sense of Hillary Clinton, Elizabeth Warren received so much more coverage. They were super present on SNL because Kate McKinnon was a cast member. So it's just, and then obviously in more traditional news media, they would have had to cover them equally to the other candidates, or at least try to. But yeah, so that's definitely a difference or a similarity in that sense. You have that similarity of horse race coverage, entertainment, and then issue coverage, and then the difference of journalistic standards, ethics, in a sense. But yeah, it would be super fascinating to have these interviews. I'm working really hard on that, and hopefully that will work out, because that would just be so good to see sort of what went into it, sort of how decisions were made. And that would definitely help to explain some of it. Yeah. Hope
Thank
that answers it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, you've certainly got lots of work to still be doing, even though you've got loads of stuff there. Brilliant. Okay, so we're very keen on coming to the end of on time at the PSA MPG seminars. So I'd just like to thank Caroline for presenting your research with us today. Hopefully we've been able to give you some interesting questions to think about.
Thank you so much.
And I'd just like to invite everyone, if you're interested, we've got another seminar on the 27th of March with Natalie Jester, who will be presenting some research on constructing neoliberal feminist subjects in arms manufacturers' social media feeds, which is our next seminar. So please look out for the registration link if you're interested. But yes, look, finally, thank you to Caroline for coming along, and thank you everybody for your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And yeah, thank you all for the questions. Great stuff. Lots to think about.